Hey everyone, welcome back to Fantasy Theory. I'm a little behind due to the holidays, but I'm back on track and here to break down, review, and uncover Easter eggs in Marvel's What If Season 2, Episode 8, titled What If the Avengers Assembled in 1602. This episode is technically part of a three-part series of the season following the What If Captain Carter fought the Hydra Stomper episode, and is a precursor to the finale What If Strange Supreme intervened. But anyway, this episode was pretty good, but I just want to jump right into this. I believe this episode is inspired by and based off the 1602 comic run that was made in 2003. The scene opens with Loki reciting Shakespeare, one of his most famous lines, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Again, the year is 1602. They are in London. As we can see, Loki has a history of enjoying theater arts from our Thor Ragnarok, when Loki sets up the reenactment of the Thor movies. Another instance of Shakespeare reference is in the first Avengers movie. Tony Stark meets Thor for the first time and makes fun of Thor and Loki's fight in the forest between each other by saying, "Does mother know you weareth her drapes?" As we see Loki holding the skull, as Hamlet does in the Shakespeare work, perhaps this represents or foreshadows that everything and everyone will die, which is essentially the plot of the episode. We see Loki standing on the stage next to a wilted dead tree, this connecting MCU's Loki overall ending when he brings the Tree of Life together and is now the Watcher of the multiverse. We see Thor making fun of his brother and laughing alongside Hela, who was queen on the throne, wielding her scepter and a different looking crown. Standing by her side is Nick Fury and Happy Hogan, or should I say Sir Nick Fury and Sir Happy Hogan. The sky opens to a green rift that starts to inhale things into itself. It seems as this has happened before in this timeline, as someone shouts from below, "It's another rift." Loki starts to get sucked into the rift. As he's floating up, he says, "The dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, no traveler returns." Loki saying this is significant as Hamlet says something very similar towards the end of the work of Hamlet. This phrase basically saying the afterlife is unknown, whether it be heaven or hell, no one knows. This relating Loki and Hamlet due to Loki being sucked into an unknown rift. Peggy Carter is also there, who was able to save Loki, however is unable to save Queen Hela, who also got sucked into the rift separating Hela from the scepter. Very quickly, Thor is crowned the new king and he is visibly angry with Peggy, basically making her public enemy number one. Thor now wields Hela's scepter, which is very reminiscent of Loki's scepter in the first Avengers, which also contained an Infinity Stone. However, this one looks like to be containing part of the Time Stone, where Loki in Avengers 1 was the Mind Stone. Peggy escapes with Loki's radioactive infused skull, and we see the Watcher start to narrate what is happening. The Watcher explains that the Scarlet Witch of this time, who is called Merlin Wanda, after Merlin the Wizard of King Arthur, brought Peggy to try and save this timeline. This is going to before when I said this is a continuation of episode 5, and want to explain why in the ending sequence of the episode, Peggy Carter falls through a red portal. The Watcher calls Peggy a fugitive of King Thor on the run with no way home. This of course being the title of Spider-Man No Way Home, where we see heroes from multiple timelines to help save one timeline, this being Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man coming to aid Tom Holland's Spider-Man. We get Peggy actually responding to the Watcher, which surprises him that she can hear him. We will learn in the next episode that she may be more powerful being than just one on the surface, just like Strange Supreme and Ultron from season 1 when they could hear and see the Watcher. The Watcher says worlds dies every day, I watch millions fade from existence, which I wonder how many are a result from Kang's destruction. The Watcher fades away right as Peggy says she won't let this universe fade away from existence. The scene cuts to Thor and his small council, which I have to say reminds me of Game of Thrones. Nick Fury starts to list where the rifts are also reaching in their world. Nebula's Observatory, Isle of Ego, and Groot Grooves, all places in the timeline, and if you couldn't tell, named after the other MCU characters. Thor is still blaming Peggy for what has happened and wants her found, where Merlin Wanda says to him she doesn't believe she is the cause of this. However, the key to fix this, she also senses someone else who was from a timeline that is yet to come that is the cause of this. The more Merlin Wanda talks about the cause of the rift, Happy Hogan starts to turn a shade of purple. This leading up to the later in the episode where he makes his appearance in full freak form. The same freak that we saw in episode 3, when Happy Hogan saved Christmas. The scene switches to Tony Stark's workspace, and to the left of the screen, it's a suit of armor in progress that looks like it has bat wings attached along with a chest piece mounted onto his suit. This being a 1602 version of Iron Man Mark 1. At the bottom of the screen is a shield with a star, which could be an early version of Captain America's shield. In another shot, we see a helmet that resembles Tony's Mark 1 helmet from the first Iron Man. Tony proceeds to faint and exposes a hammer looking exactly like Mjolnir, which we later find out Thor gave Loki the hammer and Loki has misplaced it. So this could very well be that hammer. Peggy and Tony examine the skull Loki had with a modern looking microscope, which I researched, and is interesting enough that the microscope was actually invented before 1602. But this could be Tony Stark's advanced knowledge in inventing because it looks a lot newer. Tony says that the only thing that wields enough power to close the rifts is the scepter that Thor holds now, and hinting to Peggy that he knows a guy to steal it. We now cut to Loki in a horse and carriage carrier who was ambushed by Steve Rogers, who was kind of like Robin Hood, Bucky Barnes, and Scott Lang. The trio is looking to steal money from Loki when Peggy appears, shocking Steve. This trio makes sense because in Civil War, Bucky and Scott sided with Cap against Tony. That team also consisted of Falcon, Hawkeye, and Wanda, which I wonder why they didn't include the other two men in this episode. Steve and Peggy are seen talking in some sort of secluded house in the forest. Steve's shocked still that Peggy is here in front of him, even if it's a different version of her, and he asks her what that Steve Rogers was like in her universe. She responds with, "No, I don't think I will." Now this is the exact line that the old Steve said in Endgame to Sam Wilson, aka Falcon, when Sam asked him what the rest of his life was like. Even though they speak the same line, they are both spoken with different intention. Steve is reminiscent of a life that he finally was able to live, living happy with Peggy, ultimately what he really wanted, while Peggy is crushed due to Steve becoming the Hydra Stomper, knowing she won't get her happy ending with Steve, at least for now. Happy crashes alongside Royal Yellow Jacket soldiers into their hideout, attacking both Peggy and Steve. Happy is able to shoot the Yellow Jackets from a small gun, similar to in Civil War when Hawkeye shoots Ant-Man off his arrow. Scott, being his usual funny self, says, "Shrinking is my thing, can't stand copycats," referring to the Yellow Jackets. He also looks out the window and says, "Oh great, it's the freak Hogan," which of course, I don't know if he knows that Hogan turns into the freak or if he's just calling him freak, but you see the correlation. Bucky shoots his arrow out the window at Hogan, causing him to become purple in the face and scream, reminding us that the freak form is always there to come out, just like the Hulk. Something I'd like to point out is that Peggy and Steve share the shield back and forth and are fighting very complementary to each other. They both have a similar fighting style, especially when it comes to the shield. Now Steve has had a shield of his own, which is a shield from the 1600s, but it's a shape and style coincidentally resembling the Wakandan shield from Infinity War. Him being able to use this shield while at the same time effortlessly using Peggy's shield is also reminiscent of Infinity War Steve, a very strong fighter. Hogan uses the Destroyer armor on the group, which we saw in the first Thor. This was the weapon Loki used from Odin's vault to Thor in New Mexico. Peggy tries to stop the Destroyer but ultimately surrenders. Now at the Tower of London, an executioner is seen sharpening his axe, probably for a beheading, but we see it's Red Skull. The scene jumps to Peggy talking to the Watcher and herself. She asks the Watcher for help, however he responds with saying he cannot interfere with the future. He proceeds to ask her a series of what-if questions. What if the world doesn't magically correct itself? What if the final straw that destroys the universe? What if when the universe resets, you're trapped here forever? What if you die, Peggy, seemingly unbothered, repeatedly just saying what if, which of course is the title of the show. I'm also thinking maybe these what ifs that the Watcher said could possibly be future episode titles, maybe in season 3. Let me know what you guys think. Peggy says she's going to save this universe anyway, with or without the Watcher's help. She escapes and unleashes the Hulk from his cell, who I thought at first was Dr. Doom due to his hood and mask covering his face. They both escape to Tony's workshop, where we see blueprints for a future Iron Man suit, as well as a very early on arc reactor. Tony explains about his greatest invention ever, as he calls it. This is the machine that will reveal the Forerunner who caused the rifts and the chaos alongside it and send them back to the time at which they came. Although for this machine to work, they will need the time stone from the scepter. Coincidentally, right after the explanation, Steve, Bucky, and Scott show up to help the group. This foreshadowing that the Forerunner is Infinity War Steve. Bucky says storming the castle is their kind of thing, and Steve returns Peggy's shield to her. The team devises a plan and they enter King Thor's castle and scatter in disguise. Another rift opens and Merlin, Wanda, tries to repress it. The rift causes an uproar and Peggy and Steve are waiting for Tony's signal. Hulk smashes through the wall yelling signal when Peggy says, "I guess that's the signal." The Hulk starts throwing soldiers and guards, yelling, "Dash your puny gods." This being a callback to the first Avengers when Hulk called Loki a puny god. Steve and Happy Hogan get into a sword duel when Steve slices the feather off Hogan's hat, this being the final straw that broke the camel's back and making Hogan transform into full freak form. Peggy approaches Thor saying to trust her, but Thor, still angry at her, reveals his coronation gift from the King of Wakanda, which is a sword made of vibranium. Thor now fighting Peggy, Merlin Wanda stops Thor using her magic, while still trying to contain the rift. She sees Tony approaching with his machine to close the rift. Nick Fury grabs the scepter from Thor and gives it to Tony. Even those closest to Thor understood just how deep of a mess that they were in. Merlin Wanda knew this wasn't the fault of Peggy. Tony puts the stone in the machine and Peggy activates it by pushing down into the machine with both arms. This being the same exact way to activate the Mark V suitcase that we saw in Iron Man 2. Peggy uses the powered-up machine to freeze everyone in time, revealing the Forerunner. Infinity War Steve Rogers appears. We are given a flashback of Steve and Thanos' fight in Wakanda, where Steve goes to strike Thanos with his Wakandan shield, but hits the Time Stone instead, damaging it. Doing this caused, in simple terms, a rift in time, which pushed the heroes into the Infinity War timeline to a timeline of England in 1602. This was all done by accident, of course, however it caused modern-day Marvel heroes to be pushed back in time and adapt to this era and fit themselves into modern roles with the English hierarchy. Peggy, now realizing she has to lose Steve again and send him back to his timeline, says to Steve, "We never get our happy ending," and Steve responds with, "I'm sure somewhere out there we do," and completing the task himself by touching the gauntlet on Peggy's hand. That, of course, their happy ending would be the Earth 616 Steve and Peggy Carter. Doing this saved the universe, but now leaves Peggy stranded in the 1602 timeline. We then see her sitting down at a table when a light appears behind her. She assumes is the Watcher, however it's Strange Supreme. Peggy now happy seeing who she thinks is normal Doctor Strange, assuming he'll help her get back to her timeline. She asks what he's doing here and he responds with, "Oh Peg, I've got a story to tell you." The scene ending and cutting to be continued screen for the next episode, which is the finale. Of course, stay tuned for the next breakdown, which will be the finale. There's a lot to jump in there. But alright guys, that concludes today's breakdown. I really liked the episode, and we got one more episode left of the series, like I said, which of course is a continuation of this episode, so I'm excited to see what's in store. Well, I know what's in store, but we'll get to it. You guys let me know in the comments if you like this episode, and if you have any predictions for the finale, if you haven't seen it already. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Have an incredible day.